So I will be brief. You know that the FORESTT project is a national project, but for a lot of our research questions, we really need a broader perspective. For instance, if you are interested about climate change, you know that the impact of climate change is not going to stop at the national border. You need to have more continental perspective, but even for political issue, we know that the French politics is tightly linked to the European policy, so you really need to have also this broad perspective on this issue. So this is why we have these two international speakers for the last session, and we are very pleased to have Rupert and Metodi Sotirov for this last session. I will briefly introduce Rupert, and then Arno will introduce Metodi. So Rupert is a professor at the Technical University of Munich. His research interest is mainly about disturbance and resilience of European forests. He's using remote sensing and modeling and connected to the next session, which is why we are late, Rupert. He's also using a lot of deep learning, both in simulation and in remote sensing analysis. And so today the title of his talk is Disturbance and Resilience of European Forests. So thanks a lot to be with us, Rupert.
Well, thanks for having me. It's wonderful, and I apologize that I'm not able to give my talk in French, so you will have to bear with me. Let me see how I can share my screen here. I think I am not yet, here it is. Let me see. Okay, so you should now be able to see my presentation.
Yes, it's fine, yeah. It's good.
Wonderful. Okay, so thanks again for having me. And I mean, as much as I could learn from the project that you are embarking on, this is really, really exciting. I am happy to share a little bit of our work, and I will say that by no means we have a complete understanding of the resilience of Europe's forests. So I will give you a little bit of a glimpse of what we've done, but I really, really look forward to also learning throughout the years what comes out of your project and the research that is ongoing in France at the moment. Before I jump in, I should briefly say what I mean when I say disturbance. Because this is a term, as George already mentioned, that I am using a lot because this is a lot where my research interest is. And basically, ecologically speaking, everything that's a discrete loss of life biomass in space and time can be defined as a disturbance. This is kind of the theoretical definition, but you know, it's much more tangible if you look at it. What I'm talking about are things like this: large-scale bark beetle outbreaks that have been affecting parts of Central Europe over the last years, particularly, but also wildfires. I guess many of you are quite familiar with those, and also wind throw, which still is the quantitatively most important disturbance agent in Europe, even if we haven't had one of the very big storm events just in the last few years. What I want to draw your attention to, and I will come back to this in a moment, is that from an ecological perspective, or also, if you will, from a satellite perspective, also forest management is a disturbance. What you see here is clear-cut management in the Alps, and this also shows up a lot in our data. And I'll show you in a minute how this relates to the more natural disturbance agents that I've talked about previously. So what's going on with the disturbances in Europe? What we can say, and this is, George alluded to this already, this is from our work using satellite data. What we can see from this data is that forest disturbances in Europe are increasing. What you see here on the y-axis is the amount of canopy openings relative to forest area. So a number of 1 would here mean 1% of the forest area is opened, the canopy is opened every year, regardless of the causes. So all causes taken together. And what you see is that over the last 35 years, there is a relatively steady increase in the disturbance rate in Europe's forests. If you zoom in to Central Europe and to temperate Europe, here the increase is even stronger. So we have an increase of roughly 1.5% per year. And in Central Europe, we have a doubling of disturbance rates in only 35 years. So this is quite a strong increase if you think about the long life cycles and the long turnover times of forest ecosystems. Now the million-dollar question is why, what makes disturbances increase? And as I mentioned before, we have these two large groups of disturbances. We have the natural disturbances, which I here also call the unplanned disturbances. So from a management perspective, we don't plan for them, they just happen. And then we have the planned openings of the canopy where we go in, we harvest, we have a certain management plan, we do our things in a planned manner. And if you look at these both, what you can see in this figure is that both the planned, both the management disturbances to the canopy and the unplanned, the natural disturbances to the canopy, have been increasing. So this increase that I showed you before is actually the combination of two things. An increase in management intensity through large parts of Europe and an increase in natural disturbances. From the perspective of ecosystem services and forest management, of course, the increase in natural disturbances is particularly concerning because this we cannot really control, and also because what you see here already in these time series, this is highly variable. So this means we have strong variability in the year-to-year disturbance rates, and this also means we do not know when and where these disturbances will hit, and this then has strong effects also on things like the timber market. What you can see here for the three major natural disturbance causes that we have in Europe, so beetles, fire, and wind, what you see here is that for all of them, the trends are strongly increasing. We see the biggest change rates in these for bark beetles, which have more than doubled in less than 20 years. So you see how they skyrocket in the last years with these big bark beetle outbreaks that we've had in Central Europe. I want to give you a different perspective what's been going on in the last years, and this is excess mortality. So the mortality that is in excess to the average mortality rates that we've had in these areas, and the average here being for the period 1986 to 2015, for the years 2018 to 2020. And as many of you might remember, 2018 marked for many parts of Europe the start of a multi-year drought, so that lasted at least for 2 years and in some parts for 3 years. And what you can see here is that the epicenter of the disturbance pulse, the mortality pulse that this event caused, was over central Germany and the Czech Republic. What you also see in Italy, that's the storm Vaia that shows up in red here. But what we are pretty sure is that the wave of mortality that we've seen over the last years, so from 2018 onwards, has been the biggest wave of tree mortality that we've had in Europe for at least 170 years. So quite a long time. If we go further back, the data will increasingly deteriorate, so it's harder to say anything further back. But at least from any perspective of the modern record, what we've seen in recent years has been the biggest wave of tree mortality that we've experienced in Europe for a very long time. Now, what this means is that the disturbance regimes are profoundly changing. So this change in Europe is an indication of disturbance regimes changing. And when I say disturbance regimes, I mean that disturbances have multiple elements. So there's the return interval, there's the duration of a disturbance, so when they happen, so seasonality, patch size, how big are they, what's the overall extent, how severe are they when they happen, intensity, so how, for instance, hot is a fire or how strong is a wind event. So many of these things are changing at the same time, and this makes these changes particularly challenging. And I'll show you data. So this is a stylized figure, but I'll show you the data. And this is again European scale data. And I'll show you 3 indicators of disturbance regimes here. You have the disturbance size on the axis going from the back to the forth. You have disturbance frequency on the axis going laterally. And then you have aggregation, spatial clustering of disturbances on the Z dimension here. And curiously or interestingly, what you see here is that the European forest disturbance regime stays very conservatively in an area that I here termed the basin of attraction. This is basically the area where we have been operating our forests in for close to 35 years. You see there are sparks where they go out. So the year 2000 here was actually a storm happening in December of 1999. And you see after that, the disturbance regime quickly gravitates back into that basin of attraction. But then if you look at 2018 and the following years, is we are completely leaving this basin of attraction. We are basically moving off uncharted territory. And this is what I mean by novel disturbance regimes. So disturbance regimes that, based on the combination of factors, based on the way they manifest, we haven't seen anything like that what we've experienced in recent years previously. And this, of course, brings us to the question that's also relevant, I guess, to some of you, but the question, how resilient are Europe's forests to these changes? How resilient are Europe's forests to these disturbances? And to address this, or to give a little bit of an insight from our data, is I first need to define what I mean by resilience. There is many different definitions of resilience out there and many ways of looking at this. Resilience has been a powerful and potent concept where a lot of things can be analyzed under this angle. But what I will use is basically the definition where resilience is seen as the capacity of the system to absorb disturbance and come back, maintain its important functions and services, come back after disturbance and recover. This resilience has been a very active system, as I mentioned, as I said already, and there's many definitions. And what I will use, what you can do is you can distinguish different levels of resilience, more of the like an engineering resilience perspective. So you can look at an individual tree, look at the tree rings and how they respond, for instance, to a drought event. You can more take an ecosystem perspective, or you can take a social-ecological perspective where you put humans into this equation. And Metodi will take a little bit more of a broader perspective, I think. I will start with a more ecological perspective, and I will start with a very simple question. What about forest area? What about forest cover? Are forests coming back after disturbances or not? And if you look at this, you need two things. There's two sides of the coin. So one is the disturbance interval, and that is how frequently are areas disturbed. What is the time interval, the years basically, between two disturbances hitting the similar area? And the other element here, the other part of the equation, is the recovery interval. How long does it take the forest to recover after a disturbance? How long does it take the forest to, again, reach similar amounts of forest cover? And if you look at this, so if we have very short recovery intervals, forests recover very fast, and if we have very long disturbance intervals, there's a lot of years between subsequent disturbances, then we have a forest that is highly resilient. If we have the other type of system where we have very short disturbance intervals, so disturbances happen in very close succession, and recovery is slow and takes a long time, we have a system that has low resilience, because eventually the disturbances will come with such a frequency that the system is not able to recover anymore, and then we have a change from a forested system, from a closed forestry system, to a different system, to an open system, to a macchia system, to whatever other system. I will only look at the forest cover here. The cool thing is that we can map these things from space. So what you have here is now a map of European forests for the disturbance interval on the left in red, and the recovery interval on the right in green. And you see the darker red, the shorter interval the disturbances are, and the darker green, the faster the system recovers. Now we can put these two together to get an index of resilience. And everything that's deep blue here means is that the disturbance interval is considerably longer than the recovery interval. This means that the forests recover well from disturbance, and there's a long time where we have sort of stable forest cover before it is disturbed again. On the other end of the spectrum, the red parts, where we reach values below 1, means that disturbances are happening so frequently that the recovery of the forest cover is not even complete yet. And if you look at this from a European perspective, generally we can see that we have large parts of Europe where we have quite high resilience. And quite high here means quantitatively that forests recover 10 times faster than the disturbances on average hit. So, and this is the case for 70% of the European forest area, so quite large parts. But what you also see is that we have areas that are quite prone of losing their resilience. We have areas where the recovery is considerably slower than disturbance, and that is mostly on the Iberian Peninsula. There are also a few areas also in France, but also in the Alps and in Northern Europe that show up. So these are areas where we have a combination of human-made canopy openings and then natural disturbances like fire, particularly in southwestern Europe, that lead to the fact that disturbance intervals are so short and recovery intervals are increasingly low that we have to worry about resilience in these systems. Now, from a broader social-ecological perspective, I think Metodi will tell us much more, but I will just say that, well, I mentioned that forests are ecologically resilient, but these forests that recover are not necessarily fulfilling our ecosystem services that we as humans, from a broader perspective, want very well. So we did a literature review a while back where we looked at the effect of natural disturbances on ecosystem services, and you have the 4 broad ecosystem service categories here. And what you see is, by and large, everything that we've looked at, these disturbances had largely negative effects on ecosystem services. So you see this across all categories. You see the red bars dominating, and that's the negative effects. We can also map this from a European perspective, and you see this here for 4 important ecosystem services. There's timber, climate regulation, protection from erosion, and then recreation. But what you see is there is spatial variation in the effect that these disturbances have. But what you by and large see is there's hotspot areas throughout Central and Southern Europe where a lot of these ecosystem services are at risk of being lost from disturbance. So I guess what I'm going to say here is that while forests in Europe are generally resilient to disturbance, so we in most parts of Europe's forest area, we see forests bouncing back quite vividly from disturbance. A lot of the social ecological perspectives are a little bit more dire, and we need to look into this much more in detail. I want to close my talk, though, with a perspective of how are we going about doing this? How are we getting there? What we want, in the end, is resilient forests when we see these types of disturbances. And there's 2 fundamental ways of achieving this resilience. One, on the one side, is using ecological processes. Basically meaning increasing the diversity of our forests, making them structurally and compositionally diverse, working with natural antagonists and facilitating them to address some of our disturbance risks. So a lot of these natural processes that are at play in our ecosystems that we could use and can facilitate in management. On the other end of the spectrum is what we call coerced resilience. So basically, we put a lot of human energy and a lot of human input into the system to maintain some of the services and structures that we want in this forest. So this is continued intervention. Think about very short rotation plantation. Think about chemical treatment of pests and all these kinds of things. So there's these 2 fundamental ways of achieving resilience, and they're not often, I mean, here it looks like a gradient, but often we cannot do both because the chemical treatment of pests also affects the antagonist communities, for instance. We maintain, and this is a study that we've published recently, that this coerced way of resilience, the one on the right, has a lot of negative effects on biodiversity, on ecosystem service multifunctionality, so fulfilling different ecosystem services at the same time, but also dealing with unforeseen challenges, so the unknown unknowns, the things that are still ahead of us and we cannot plan as of yet. So I guess what I maintain here, or what I would try to convince you, is that looking deeper into these ecological mechanisms is a good pathway, because we also know that these disturbances offer opportunities. I told you that there's a lot of challenges that come with these disturbances, but what I show you here is that disturbances have quite high, or disturbed areas have quite high level of biodiversity. This is a study that covers more than 3,000 individual species across a large range of functional groups. And what you basically see is you see diversity levels summarized across the three broad kingdoms for a gradient of forest development, from regenerating forests all the way to old forests. And the disturbed forests, they are at the end or at the beginning of the plot, depending on how you see this. And if you look at the figures for animals and plants, you see they are very, very high in this disturbed forest. So there is actually an opportunity of countering our biodiversity crisis by using these disturbances that we have happen naturally to the benefit of the ecosystem. What we also see, and this is now a different way of looking at it, that disturbances create a high diversity in structures on the landscape. So something that we call beta diversity. If you go from one stand to the next stand, how different will they be? And this beta diversity here from a study from 2 national parks in Germany goes up very, very strongly with disturbance. So I guess what I'm trying to convince you is that, yes, we need to manage for resilience because there's a lot of detrimental effects. But if we do this the right way, if we do this using ecological processes, we could buffer some of these negative disturbance effects, but even have positive effects on the level of biodiversity. And overall, I would like to close with maintaining that these disturbances, they also lead to reorganization in our forests. Forests can be stable or can be changing very little for many, many decades, and then there is a disturbance, and after that disturbance, it's like, in a card game, the deck of cards is shuffled anew. A lot of new species can come in, the system can change quite fundamentally. So what I would maintain is that we need this kind of change because we are facing an era of drastic climate change. And these disturbances that we are seeing, this time of frequent disturbances that we're looking at now, also offers a lot of opportunities for adaptation. Autonomous adaptation, where the system adapts in and of itself, but also where we as managers can come in, can plant new species, can introduce new ways of silviculture after these disturbances. So with that, I'm at the end of my talk. Just to summarize, we see that disturbances are increasing in Europe, and we see the emergence of novel disturbance regimes. Forests in Europe generally have been found to have high resilience. They recover quite quickly, but there are areas of concern. From the perspective of the humans, there are negative impacts on ecosystem services that we need to manage, that we need to increase their resilience, but there's also opportunities, for instance, for adapting our forests to climate change and in the context of the biodiversity crisis that we're in. With that, I just wanted to say thank you to everybody who contributed. A lot of the research that I showed is came out of the great team that I'm happy to work with. A lot of national and international collaborators, some of whom are in the room here, and also the funding institutions that supported this work. And with that, I am very, very happy to take your questions. And I will say that unfortunately I have to leave around 6 or a little bit later because I have childcare duties to take over. So my daughter will come home and I have to take care of her. But I'm very much looking forward to still listening in on Metodi's talk and the discussion as far as I can. Thanks for listening and thanks for having me. And I'm happy to hear your questions and I'm looking forward to the discussion.
Thank you, Rupert. So we will take some questions if you have a bit of time.
Attends, où est-ce qu'il y a les questions? Là?
Hi, I don't know if you can hear me.
Yes, works
Okay.
perfectly.
Yes, I think I've heard that some researchers thought that the resilience capacity is dependent on the intensity of the disturbance. So if there is a great disturbance on the forest, then there will be less capacity to regenerate from it. So I've heard that sometimes it could be better to let the disturbance happen, not protect the forest, not strictly, to let small disturbance happen instead of protecting it, for example, from the fire. So no big fires, for example, happen in the forest, and then there is a better resilience capacity. Is there any studies that you know about that would support that thinking?
Yeah, this is a very good question. Indeed, it is the case that we are seeing that often small disturbances create heterogeneity on the landscape and they create structural diversity. And this is often something that helps forests to come back after resilience, for disturbances to have lower severity. So that means that we have some surviving trees and they can come back then easier after a disturbance that happens. The specific element that you are referring to in terms of fire is also known as the fire paradox in the literature. So that means that sometimes fighting fire in the long run leads to more or more severe fires. This is in the US known as Smokey the Bear policy, that basically, reducing or trying to stamp out each fire immediately, then eventually leads to bigger fires that are very hard to fight. So I think, yes, there is some indication that this is actually the case, but I think this is also something that we need to evaluate very carefully in the context of every specific forest. So if you have a fire that burns close to a human structure, to settlements, for instance, you will obviously try to fight the fire as hard as possible and try to put the fire out. I think partly this discussion that is carried over from the US is also not entirely applicable to Europe, because the structures of our landscapes is much more smaller scale. So sometimes it's really hard in our very densely populated Central European landscapes, for instance, to let the disturbances really happen. But what I would agree with is that we can learn from disturbances and can partly, for instance, in management, also think about emulating natural disturbance regimes to maintain the resilience of our ecosystems, if this kind of makes sense. So I think, yes, a lot of what you said rings true and has also literature to support it. But I think the important question is, how do we translate this into management, and how can we tailor this and target this to the landscapes that we have, particularly in a European, or more specifically in a Central European or Western European context?
Thank you, Rupert. So we have another question.
Yes, thank you very much for your talk and for making it quite clear even for non-specialists. I'm a social scientist, and I was wondering about this question of a novel disturbance regime and what you said at the end about the increase in diversity and sources of opportunities. Is it a knowledge that is true under old disturbance regime? And what about this novel disturbance regime? Is it still source of opportunity and increase in alpha and beta diversity? Yes, so this is my question. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you for the question. It's a very, very good question. And I don't think that we have, that I have a good answer or a satisfying answer to this question, because I think in many parts of the world we don't know. We don't even know how novel or how different the disturbance regime will be. And then subsequently, we don't know what the biodiversity response will be. What we do see is that, I mean, in many parts of the world, Europe specifically, our classical mode of forest management was trying to avoid all disturbances at all costs most of the time, and keeping the forests as dark and as closed as possible. And what we're seeing is that some disturbance is actually good for biodiversity. But there's a lot of considerations, both on theoretical grounds and also some empirical data, that if you have very, very high levels of disturbance, that you also have a decreasing level of diversity. So I showed you this figure for for beta diversity that goes up. But what we can also see is that at the same time, alpha diversity has a unimodal relationship with disturbance rates. So the diversity locally is highest at intermediate disturbances and then goes down. So I guess it's always a little bit a question of which scale you're looking at. And then the other thing is you can look at various ways of analyzing or integrating diversity. So what I showed you is a very simplistic view, basically looking at species richness, which is one way. I mean, we can count species, and this is what you get. This is a very simple way of looking at it. But of course, there is winners and losers in this. So there are some species that are not at all very well adapted to disturbed areas and that need old and big trees, and they are not happy if all of these trees are gone all of a sudden. So I think this requires a quite specific consideration. I would say what we've seen so far is that, and we've actually now also looked at this experimentally, so we can now prove also experimentally that these disturbances are actually increasing species diversity. But I would assume, and based on theory, there is a limit to this. So if, in my radar chart, we're getting out into these red areas, eventually these positive effects might go away. And the question, I guess, that is still to be resolved for research is, where do we hit this tipping point? What I can tell you is, for a landscape in the Alps that we've looked at very in detail, we are still seeing a positive effect currently with the current disturbance regime, and also so we did simulations on the future climate regimes. Anything in terms of climate that we are expecting to happen until the year 2100, the disturbance effect on biodiversity would still be positive for that landscape. But this is, of course, only one specific case study, and this could be very different in the south of France, for instance, or in the north of Finland. So I think we need much more local studies and local understanding to really give a complete answer to that question.
Okay, thank you, Rupert. I think maybe we should let you run to the childcare.
Thank you
Thanks
for having
a lot.
me, and thanks for the question.
Thanks a lot.
Bye.
Thank you, Rupert. Now we will welcome Metodi Sotirov, who is not our second speaker. Metodi is a senior researcher and associate professor at the chair of Forest and Environmental Policy of Freiburg. Metodi is an expert in the field of forest policy, as Rupert introduced you a little bit. He does research in policy studies, environmental social sciences, and sustainable natural resource management. He works mainly on, as you will see, on issues of coherence between sectoral policies and between national, European, and international policies. He has collaborated on many very good, very interesting research projects and carried out several expert reports also for the European institutions. Today, you will be talking to us about the socio-economic and political factors influencing social-ecological resilience of forests. I would like to thank you warmly for being here today, Metodi. You can start if you want. Try to share maybe your screen.
Yes, thank you so much for your very kind invitation, for the very, hopefully, interesting introduction. Yes, I'm trying to now share the screen with you. So I hope you can see my presentation in presenter mode.
Yes.
Right? Okay, thank you so much. So thank you, Arnaud, and
you can
good
maybe in full screen. You can.
Yeah. All right. Yes. I hope
yes.
now it's working.
Perfect.
Excellent. Thank you so much, Arnaud. And yes, good afternoon to all colleagues, to all guests, all very interested audiences here. Yes, it's my pleasure to present you with something like a synopsis or synthesis of some of my ongoing or recently done works on the political and socioeconomic factors of forest resilience in Europe. So it's, of course, a collaborative work to which many other colleagues from different disciplines, economics, forest ecology, trade, but also social and political sciences have contributed. So they are all listed there, and yes, I will, of course, like to acknowledge them. So I believe Rupert, with his excellent, very enjoyable, and of course very insightful talk, already kind of set the scene and yeah, made a very relevant argument that forests need to be seen as socio-ecological systems. And now I believe what's here on this slide would be kind of at least my understanding of how we could see forest ecosystem as socio-ecological systems. Something that will help me guide you through this presentation today. Something actually that was co-designed, co-developed in a excellent collaboration with Arnaud and other colleagues from the Bordeaux Research Institute, which I'm very grateful for. So basically, one would say that forest is heavily dependent on both direct and indirect drivers. So direct drivers will be the forestry measures, the forest management practices that forest owners, forest users, forest managers, and others are making and implementing. So this is in the left half of this presentation, in the middle. And basically, this then very much results in different structures, in different products that the forest landscape is providing to us. This is more or less the bottom, and then of course the right half of this presentation. And we probably know and have to assume at least that there are important so-called indirect drivers of forest management, which very much influence the very decisions of forest owners and managers and other users. And these are basically to be grouped into three basic clusters. So it's very much about what the public wants from forest owners and forest users. So it's the public opinion, if you want so. It's also very much what decision makers in policy have designed as policy instruments, as strategies, as legislation, etc. Something that they want forest owners, forest managers to apply and to see achieved through their forest management. But out there, of course, there are market forces, supply, demand, price questions that's very much sent out other, let's say, more rational economic signals to forest owners and managers. So and these indirect drivers under the headings of public opinion, policy, and markets are assumed to be influencing forest management here. But as Rupert very rightly said that, well, we are seeing more and more also the influence of another very, very important direct driver of change, which is climate change, right? So this is something that I put in the middle here, something that probably is the main concern of your sessions and conferences along the last days and along the next days. So what I'm going to guide you through is first a kind of a synthesis of a very recent report that all the other colleagues and I had the privilege to work on, very much supported by the IUFRO, by the International Union Forest Research Organization. There was a study, actually initially designed to look at the different drivers of the provision of forest goods and services in a time of a rapid ecological but also socioeconomic changes. Now, in the end, the final report kind of took a specific focus on the supply of woods and in specific, very important key forest product. But in the report, you will see more results in terms of other ecosystem goods and services like biodiversity, carbon, and a few more. All right, so I'm going to present you with kind of a summary of the main results that we more or less synthesized based on a very systematic literature review, but also in terms also of some key expert interviews and some other important methods here like expert workshops, etc. So to begin, something that basically Rupert already very well covered in his talk. So among the most important development drivers, definitely one could probably see the role of the very diversity of forest types or forest ecosystems across Europe. So we basically know that the boreal forests are quite different in their ecosystem needs and processes compared to the Mediterranean forests. They probably differ from the continental forests, etc., etc. Still, regardless of this diversity of forest types, we do probably have 6 major tree species that we work with now for many decades, if not centuries. So it's pine, it's spruce, it's beech and oak, and to some extent also birch and fir. That's basically are the most important tree species in our more or less semi-natural managed forest in Europe. We know that basically recently the growing stock has been increasing. Also the land area of the EU27 at least has remained more or less stable or slightly increasing, which is quite different from probably other parts of the world that are suffering and showing bigger rates of deforestation and forest degradation, right? An important characteristics of our forests is that about 85% of our forests in Europe are managed mainly with the aim for wood production, but also some other services. All right, now I'm turning to something that Rupert already very, very well covered, so I'm not going to repeat that or not delve in detail. But in our study, we also kind of looked at forest projection studies, climate scenarios, etc., and basically the key message here is that already now, but also in the near or distant future, we can really assume and expect that there will be increase in mean and temperatures, more or less in all regions in Europe, and there will be changes in precipitation patterns, with some regions losing, let's say, precipitation, others becoming more humid, if you want so. However, the overall key message here will be that climate change is going to be a big driver of changes in the forest ecosystems. So it's something that Rupert already covered very well. I'm not going to repeat that. Only that you see here that the climate change impacts seem to be leading to more and growing forest disturbances, windstorms, droughts, pathogens, fires, something that Rupert already very well covered. But also in terms of forest growth, there will be some regions in Europe probably benefiting from climate changes like Scandinavian boreal forests, others quite suffering, the Mediterranean region, and others somewhere in between. Right, so now finally I turn to the socio-economic and political factors that we also analyzed and covered well in this EUFOR study. So now I'm going to talk about the policy and legal drivers of forest management in general, but also forest resilience in particular. So in our study, we found quite of a variety of a number of different policies and legal standards or regulations at the very different levels, on the global, on the pan-European, on the European Union, but also on the national level. And in essence, time is now short, of course, to present all of them, but in essence, we may conclude here that basically some sets of these policies rather restrict forest use in terms of wood production, whereas another set of these policies would probably promote forest use in terms of more wood production. And all these different policies, they do really differ in terms of their policy priorities. Some of them would like to promote forest biodiversity conservation, like, for example, the new biodiversity strategy, partly the new the new forest strategy, the very recent nature restoration law with chapters on forests, but also the well-existing or long-existing habitats and birds directives with the Natura 2000 network of protected areas, but now also the newly adopted EU deforestation regulation, which has or will have probably also impacts also on EU forests too. This will be one side of the spectrum. Another will be policies that are very much promoting the intensive use of forests and other lands to produce more bioenergy, like the EU Renewable Energy Directive, but also the bioeconomy strategy. And there are, of course, still some policies that somehow try to find a balance between these two extremes, to secure something like a multifunctional forestry, like, for example, the Forest Europe non-legally binding policy on criteria indicators, standard forest management, the Common Agricultural Policy with its rural development regulation and funding schemes, partly also the European Green Deal, the LULUCF regulation, and a few more. And the very interesting thing here is that across Europe, we do have also a variety of national priorities, with some countries, some regions putting rather an emphasis on bioenergy and carbon forestry and sustainable yield production, mainly in the Baltic, but also in some Central and Eastern European countries. Others rather more putting an emphasis on forest biodiversity conservation, on non-timber priorities, like probably countries in Western and some Southern European countries. And probably the majority of countries pretty much trying to still keep a balance between these two different aspects of sustainability and trying to secure multifunctional forestry or multi-purpose forestry, like in countries in Central Western and some Eastern European countries. All right, and basically this is really important because policy priorities pretty much act as an indirect driver of forest management. And in a few minutes from now, I'll show you how this probably play out in real life forest management in 4 countries that we have studied, in Germany, in Poland, and Slovenia, and also in Sweden, something that I'm going to come back. Right, now, this is a slide that shows us another very important aspects of forest management in general, but also forest resilience in particular, which are the property rights and also the tenure rights. To the left, you will see the card of Europe, which actually says that the more we go to the north or the more we go to the west in Europe, the more we have, or the higher the share of privately owned forests. The more we go to the east, so to say, the opposite direction, the more we are going to meet state-owned forest owners or state-owned enterprises that own forests. And this is an important factor because in the middle and to the right, you see a graph again of Europe in terms of the forest property rights. I mean, it calculated, here is an index in terms of the degree of freedom to make decisions, what to do and what to not to do, and the freedom from, let's say, legally binding state regulations. And there is a certain pattern. The more you are in Eastern Europe, the more you are kind of obliged to follow legally binding rules by the state authorities, and you have less freedom in your forest management choice. The more you go up, so to say, to the boreal region or to the western part of Europe, the more you have this kind of freedom to make decisions, and you would probably more work with market-based instruments. Something that's really important. Why it is important? Well, because we found out through our review of existing studies that out there is not just one type of a forest owner, but rather at least 5, if not 6 different types of forest owners that quite differently manage their forests and are quite differently responding to climate change impacts, to policy, to market signals, if you want so. So we have optimizers that are making profits from their forests, and they, of course, make wood out of their business operations, that they want to actually keep their rather profit-oriented, more or less even age forestry, very much based on clear cutting or other intensive forest management practices. This is the one extreme. Another are the so-called environmentalists, to the very right in the top of these slides. Those environmentally concerned forest owners that on a purpose actually don't manage actively their forests, or actually they implement their conservation management, try to practice close to nature forest management through passive or active restoration forest management. And in between, we have 3 further very important types. The passive forest owners that basically don't manage their forest because they don't know about these forests, they don't live near their forest, or they don't care, they are not aware, or they are so small that it's not really very rational for them to manage those forests. And basically, they would probably not manage those forests, or regardless the impact. We do have also still traditional forest owners that are still around, close to their forest, but they use their forest only on sporadic, in a sporadic way, only every 10 or 15, 12 or 20 years, only just to meet some household needs. And basically, they see the forest as saving bankers' capital, and they kind of practice something like a low-intensive, one would say, selective cutting forestry. And not to forget, of course, the multifunctional forest owners having a bigger share, of course, that try to provide different forest ecosystem goods and services like timber production, recreation, biodiversity, water, climate, carbon sequestration, etc., through something like a combined objective forestry. And this is not to be underestimated. Is pretty socio-economic and political drivers of forest management, because in the end they kind of result in priority forest management practices. And in the top right, you will see that still in Europe, the majority of forest management practices are belonging either to clear cutting systems or to uniform shelterboard systems, again, kind of more intensive forest management practice that actually leads more or less to even aged forest stands, to monocultures that basically are known to be more sensible and more fragile to climate change-induced forest disturbances. And the share of close to nature forest management or other more, let's say, ecologically friendly forest management is still not that big. And one could explain that with these different types of forest owners. Now, very important is to not forget, of course, the socioeconomic factors. We live now in a decades or in an age where also the bioeconomy is supposed to be flourishing, to be booming. And we do see quite some innovations out there on the market, but also in terms of technology. And on this table, I can probably show you that for many new or old products, including packaging materials, sawn timber, veneer, bioenergy, biofuels, biochemicals, biotextiles, or engineering products, scientists do predict quite of a growth, either stable growth or slow growth or very fast growth, but still growth in terms of production, trade, and consumption of those commodities. The only probably sector that probably is predicted to be decreasing in its growth trend is paper, at least probably classical paper products. But still, one can probably still take into account the very, very rapidly growing technological innovations here, more or less offering both opportunities but also some risks in terms of adapting forests to climate change induced disturbances. Now, next to the markets, we of course live in a bigger context where the society at large is demanding particular forest goods and services as consumers, yes, but it's also demanding also specific things that the forests need to deliver. And this is very much what's it's behind public opinion and public discourses and public pressure on forests. And in a rather recent synthesis study, the authors found that while forest ecosystem goods and services are highly valued, timber, biodiversity, climate, carbon, recreation, etc., water, still society at large has a clear preference for forest protection and forest biodiversity conservation. And at the very same time, society at large is very skeptical about the environmental performance of forest-based industries. So there is a general distrust or even dislike against forest-based businesses. And this is the paradox in this story. At the very same time, the society at large actually perceives wood products as environmentally friendly and something that is nice and probably even must to have. So this is a kind of a paradox. You kind of decline or object, let's say, forest management, timber harvesting, but at the very same time, you would very much appreciate the very fine product after that. And we do see similar things also in Germany with media attention skyrocketing the topic of forest disturbances, forest damages over time. All right. Now, time is short. I'm going to skip all these probably tables here in terms of a very recent research on Germany, Poland, Slovenia, and Poland. Sorry, on Sweden. There is a mistake. Sorry about that. Generally, all these tables and all these figures and data point to one very important, I'm going to come back to this, to a few general observations. First, forest owners and managers do find forest biodiversity, climate, and water policies as very important driving factors for their forest management, but also to their decisions how to adapt their forest to climate change impacts. At the very same time, there are quite of issues to be still resolved in terms of the lack of cross-sectoral policy coherence between these forest, biodiversity, climate, water, and agricultural policies. So there are different signals that different policies are sending out to the forest owners and forest managers, and the forest owners and managers are kind of trapped in decision dilemmas. How to respond? Shall we plant more biodiverse trees, or shall we refrain at all from forest operations in order to let nature do the job, so to say? So there are quite many open questions out there. In terms of technological innovations, forest owners and also national level policymakers do perceive the very, very important impacts of them already on forest management. Timber prices or the timber markets are also very much found to be important drivers of forest management in particular, but also on the decisions how to adapt to climate change disturbances. And yes, incentives in the form of subsidies or market premiums, new markets, new products, etc., are also seen as a very important driver for how forest owners and managers would adapt to climate change impact. And now I would like to give you a specific idea of how at least your neighboring country, the stakeholders in Germany, are discussing on adapting to the climate change impact. Rupert made a very clear argument that Germany was hit hardest, if you want so, in the last few years. And now this triggered really very, very important discussions in Germany on how to best adapt to those climate change impacts, how to make forests resilient. And I do see actually three different kind of positions here or mindsets, not only two, as Rupert showed. So the one is the very traditional sustain and yield mindset. So people that adhere to this mindset believe that climate change impacts in forests are pretty much caused by external events. So foresters are not guilty, have made no mistakes. And they believe that they have to intervene immediately through sanitary clear cuts, through reforestation, to plant, again, either coniferous tree species or some mixed, ideally climate-adapted exotic tree species is also discussed and considered. There must be an active timber use, and basically one would do best job if carbon is stored in timber products. And this is different from another set of actors that rather support of a more multi-purpose forestry position here. They do believe that, yes, forests need to remain multifunctional, and basically we need to adapt to climate, and in the same time we have to, well, mitigate climate change. And this is to be done through forest reconstruction, through making climate adaptive, close to nature forests, ideally that are systemically managed, forests that are probably composed of site-adapted coniferous and deciduous trees. Maybe there is a need to reduce large-scale forest calamities risk, and there must be a carbon sequestration in both mixed forest, standing forest, but also in timber products. And this is it's quite different from another mindset, people that also support mindset that I would call ecosystem management. Those guys do see rather forestry failures as main causes for the forest disturbances in Germany and also in Europe. And they are thinking of old growth forests, forest set aside as the best solution how to adapt to climate change, ideally through mixed deciduous forests. They actually object and actually reject large-scale sanitary clear cuts, very rapid reforestation through planting, and they claim and they support natural regeneration. They go for close to nature forest management, for biodiversity conservation, rather for more passive conservationist approach. Well, I'm close to conclude my speech. So basically, I would conclude that the most drivers of forest resilience can be seen in the domains of policy, economy, and society. And in particular, things like policy and laws and forest ownerships are key drivers that are likely to have a very important influence on how forest resilience is achieved or not achieved in the future, and they can be used as leverage points. At the very same time, timber markets, public opinion, climate change are also very important drivers of future change. However, they can be hardly changed, at least from the forest sector. So basically, it remains probably to work towards changing probably national and EU policy and legal frameworks, and also working together with forest owners and forest management to make those changes. I'm so grateful for your time and your interest, and thank you so much, and conclude here. Thank you.
Thank you, Metodi, for showing us that social and political and economic variables are also very, very important. Thank you for that, Metodi. And it is also very inspiring for us, because I think that many of your idea and work will have to be implemented here in France also, and maybe with the same results. Don't know. Are there some questions for Metodi?
Thank you very much. In your talk and in other talks today, forests were treated as systems, large-scale systems that are planted and managed by professionals. Now, we increasingly have citizens' forests planted by citizens, very small surfaces, but what, in your opinion, is the role of these citizen forests to make the population understand how a forest works?
Yes, thank you so much for this very good question. Yes, absolutely. Well, urban forests or forests that are created, planted by citizens can have two probably very important functions. First, they can help, of course, increase the forest area and probably help also mitigate climate change, but also help adapt cities, urban infrastructure to the climate change impacts. And the second, you're absolutely right, the citizens' forest can be very important showcases to learn how probably forests grow, can be probably maintained and planted. Now, the question here is, of course, what's really, how and what is really planted and with which purpose. And I believe it's really important to make also the citizens aware that planting trees is in general is a very good idea. However, we need to be aware that planting trees needs to be also taught as an action that has to contribute to make our forest not only climate resilient but also more biodiverse, I guess. So basically, and of course, there are always trade-offs in planting trees. You know, if you plant trees, basically you consume the area that is not to be used by other land users, being farmers, being infrastructure development, etc., right? So there may be also quite some tensions arising out of planting trees. So I would say, yes, in general, yes, planting trees by citizens, for citizens, a very, very good idea, will help. Definitely won't be the overall and the big solution, but will help on the way to make the big transformation. But we need to stay in touch with citizens and discuss with them, learn from them, but also educate them about the likely trade-offs around planted forests, urban forests, in a general context, forest management. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Metodi. Someone has another question? Yes.
Thank you, Metodi. We have seen a kind of a split between two populations that like close to nature forestry. There are traditional and ecologists. How do you think that there can be some convergence between these two populations?
Yes, thank you. This is a great question too. Yes, in general, yes, we do see also the impact of the rural-urban divide, right? I mean, basically, it's no secret, and it's actually kind of a conventional wisdom that basically urban population supports more and more let's say amenity values like biodiversity, water, fresh air, recreation, etc., whereas probably rural population is more concerned and interested in securing rather the products and the commodity, in this case, in our case, timber, but also, of course, non-timber products. How to bridge them? I guess these two parties need to talk more with each other and less past each other. What we need probably to organize is something like probably interfaces and platforms, ideally to be moderated by us scientists as ideally honest brokers, to offer discussion forums, discussion and learning platforms for both rural and urban citizens to come together, discuss, first probably disagree, hopefully over time to agree on certain aspects, or if they still disagree, still to agree on some possible policy and other instruments that can help reduce their losses, or probably reduce these different misperceptions, etc. Yeah, so I would say in short, we need to have something like collaborative learning-based platforms and mechanisms to bring those different audiences together, because their claims are important, they're legitimate, but they are at odds with each other, in conflict with each other, and basically we need to bring them together and see how we can reach them and reduce at least the trade-offs between them if we can't find a common position all the time. Thank you.
Thank you, Metodi. Thanks a lot. I think we will keep this in mind, being honest brokers. Maybe we can all be honest brokers between disciplines, between also scientists and people from the society. And if we all try to be honest brokers in this forest community, it will be a good thing, I think, at the end. Thanks a lot, Metodi. See you soon, I hope. And we will close our journey here now, and we will have a break. Without you, I'm sorry.
Thank you so much.
Bye,
Once
Metodi.
again, thank you for having me. And yes, let's keep in touch and do something together. There is a lot that we can do together. And good luck and big success for your event.
Bye bye.
To hear more about it. Bye.
Thanks, Metodi. Bye.
Bye.
Bon, merci à toutes et tous d'avoir suivi cette journée très très intense. Cette journée, on vous invite à un moment de convivialité. Ah, on m'entend pas. D'accord. Bon, on vous invite à un moment de convivialité qui va durer un petit moment quand même. Autour des posters, et on va échanger quand même, et puis on va boire un verre ensemble.